Dr. Qamar Cheema, and I'm thrilled to have Professor Soren Singh, who is a visiting professor at the University of British Columbia. Thank you very much, Professor Soren Singh, for your time for my YouTube channel.
Thank you, Kamar. It is always my pleasure to join your channel for a discussion.
Thank you. And viewers, please do subscribe the new word with Dr. Cheema. So, Professor Soren Singh, you just have written a blog, and I really wanted that we should have a conversation. The blog you wrote at the Jawaharlal Nehru University School of International Studies. Before talking that what you have written in that blog on that is on the West Asian core, I want to speak with you generally initially on the Indian foreign policy. So, Professor, what do you think that what are the determinants of Indian foreign policy? And you can explain us with the historical context so that we can understand that are the determinants changing, or India still stands on the determinants which it had back in 1947. So please, yes.
Thank you, Kamar, for inviting me for this discussion. And let me say, foreign policy of any country, whether it is India or Pakistan or any other country, is usually guided by what is called national interest, or sometimes it is called reasons of state. Uh, that is guided by certain enduring, continuing factors, but also some more recent or immediate drivers that determine how a country or the leadership in that country decides what is that national interest that foreign policy is trying to advocate or achieve. Very clearly, given the fact, as you alluded to, India being an ancient civilization, and there are influences that have been enduring over millennia, and they often influence the mindset or the priorities of India's leadership, and that would show how India behaves with the other countries, both in the immediate neighborhood, extended neighborhood, and the larger world in that sense. And one central axiom, which is very often utilized in discussing foreign policy, looking from civilizational and cultural perspective, which is, as I said, is enduring element, is an expression called Vasudeva Kutumbakam, that in Indian civilizational narratives, it was always highlighted that Indian, sages, great kings, emperors, always looked at world as one family, and then in that family, India is located, and India had to constantly engage with this outside world, not shy away from engaging with the outside world. Now, a quick example of that could be how uh, despite being embroiled with very, very difficult challenges after independence, you would remember the chaos of partition, the whole deindustrialization of India during colonial period, and poverty, backwardness, illiteracy, disease. Despite all these very, very uphill challenges for the new leadership, Indian leadership from the very beginning was engaged with the region and with international affairs very, very seriously. To give you one or two quick examples, could be how India, even while it was still a colony and it was in process of gradual and peaceful transfer of power, became founding member of United Nations, even when it was not an independent country, or it organized something called Asian Relations Conference to push for decolonization before its independence. So the connect that India civilizationally and therefore India's leadership that was participating in liberation movement or freedom struggle uh, felt that they have to constantly be engaged with other colonized societies of Asia, developed countries like, for example, Commonwealth or the United Nations. So that is something which is very enduring, which pushes India to be constantly engaged with outside world, and that guides India's foreign policy. In fact, India is among very few countries where the constitution itself has an article that says that Indian successive leaderships would be working for world peace. Now, second very closely enduring element that guides foreign policy is the influence of culture and religion. Whether it is Buddhism or Jainism or Hinduism, most of them have prescribed what is called golden mean, the middle path. So, Indian foreign policy has avoided taking extremes of either to one side or the other. And in foreign policy, this is reflected by something called non alignment. And non alignment means that India did not want to be part and parcel of military alliances, either those led by United States or those led by Soviet Union at that time. And that policy was the prominent guiding principle of India's foreign engagements during Cold War, particularly. At end of Cold War, India moved from non-alignment to multi-alignments. And that was partly also guided by the fact that India began to emerge and be seen as an emerging country. So that has seen India moving slightly away from least developed countries, non-alignment or group of 77 to now engaging much more with emerging economies, middle powers. And that pushed India's foreign policy more or less still staying within the bandwidth of non-alignment, but now calling it multi-alignment, meaning aligning with as many countries in as many sectors, in as many partnerships as possible. And Middle East, since I'm speaking to a channel from Pakistan, Middle East is a good example where India is very close today to Iran, to UAE, to Saudi Arabia, to Israel. Everyone, countries that don't really see eye to eye with each other, are all friendly to India today. And therefore, the article you mentioned that I published recently in Asia Times is about how India is now part of the second quad or quadrilateral. The first one, of course, is in Asia Pacific or Indo Pacific, which is US, Australia, Japan, India. Now, in Middle East also, UAE and Israel have joined India and USA to make another quadrilateral. So, this is how the enduring factors have influenced, and very quickly, uh, more immediate factors also influence the relationship. So, as I just mentioned, India sees itself as an emerging economy, emerging country. Its relationship with major powers has become very different compared to how it was earlier. And economics has become the focus of India's foreign policy. Likewise, for example, it has found a lot of difficulties in its immediate neighborhood. So, India has focused much more on East, which means engaging BIMSTEC in Bay of Bengal or engaging ASEAN in Act East policy, or going beyond to the Indo-Pacific and Act Far East policy, going all the way to Vladivostok, engaging Eurasia. So looking at immediate factors again, it influences that India is now looking much more to the east from 1990s. And of course, more recently, if you look at the current regime in power in India, it has tried to reconnect with the outside world using very important two linkages of Indian diaspora or Indian culture and religion. So, Indian Prime Minister, when he's traveling abroad, you see him addressing Indian diaspora community all the time, using them as a connect with those countries that he's visiting. So, there are recent factors, there are immediate factors, and there are enduring factors that together push India into conducting itself in regional and global stage. And a last point I think is important to underline how India's foreign policy has constantly valued making contributions to building peace much more than building prosperity. Prosperity is important, but for India's foreign policy, peace is still much more important, which has guided India's foreign policy engagement around the world. And I think that is briefly what I think is could be described as the guiding principles of India's foreign policy.
But Professor, just where you just left your argument, that is about peace. What do you think that what is India's contribution for peace in South Asia? Because um, India has gone nuclear. India has been the largest arms importer, and India has basically set the tone for the region for this armament. Do you think that these are the weapons for the peace, or do you think that this is another competition where countries like Pakistan had to go into uh, having this military has this military armament in terms of their own peace. So how do you see that the when India is spending a lot of money on the defense?
Thank you, Kama. I think you have asked a question that allows me to address this very interesting question, sometime raised, of India's expenditure on defense, India's pursuit of nuclear weapons. I think it is important to put that in context. India, of course, is a country that wants to push for building peace in the region and with the rest of the world. But India lives in a scenario which has to be understood. Very often, pursuing peace blindly could be very dangerous because other countries could perceive this as India's weakness, that India is now vulnerable and can be pushed around or colonized again or something like that. And so, looking at the total environment in which India exists is where that assessment has to be made. Whether India's focus on defense buildup is proportional, is it conservative, or is it over ambitious? Is it far more aggressive build up, or is it very defensive build up? That is where I think the pursuit for peace has to be understood. Very clearly, India perhaps is only major nuclear weapon state where nuclear science was the primary focus of research. Again, even before independence, India had started making efforts in training scientists into pursuit of scientific knowledge, including nuclear science. And even if we have records to prove that the first important nuclear scientist of India, Homi Bhabha, had said that way back in 1966 that if political leadership allows him, he will take maximum 18 months to produce the nuclear weapon. And that he had said in context of China's nuclear test of 1964. But India took, long time from 66 to 74 when the first nuclear device was tested. And then, of course, another 26 years from 74 to 98 when a nuclear weapon test happened. So this is a unique example of inordinate delay in when India had the capability to go for nuclear weaponization and when India finally chose to go for weaponization. And there are explanations as to how the CTBT, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, was being negotiated in 1996, which, if implemented, would have closed down India's option to ever build nuclear weapons. And that pushed India to utilizing that option rather than surrendering that option without utilizing that option. And even after utilizing that option, India has continued with what we call minimum credible deterrence. And so India has not pursued the example of superpowers like USSR or United States, who together had reached as much as 50,000 warheads at one stage. They have come down from there. India has made sure it has as little of these nuclear weapons as are absolutely necessary in India's assessment. And India's nuclear weapons and stockpiles, therefore, have to be understood not just in comparison of South Asia, where only Pakistan is the other nuclear weapon state, but India's primary concern has always been China. And therefore, India's defense procurements, defense spending have to be understood by the challenges that India faces. And therefore, India is not that is only located in South Asia. And we believe India is located in Southern Asia, where China is an inordinate power, which again is a kind of a challenge to India. And therefore, I think if you assess the challenges that India had and the kind of investments India is making on defense, perhaps it indicates enormous conservatism in pursuing that defensive approach to ensuring credible minimum security for Indian nation. And that I think is partly the reason I said it is driven far more by search for peace rather than being an aggressive nation looking for war wherever it can find. Of course, there are interpretations, and between India and Pakistan, there could be interpretations. And I respect scholars from Pakistan making their own interpretation, but that doesn't mean that the Indian interpretations are exactly the same.
Hmm. So, Professor, in your article which you have written for the Asian Times, you have explained that this I2U2 is basically is a new template for to tackle unfolding challenges. So, what do you believe are basically the challenges which this I2U2 can tackle? Or India, being a South Asian country, is being made a Middle Eastern power, or so please just explain us in this reference to the context. What do you mean by the challenges and how India became a South Asian power, became a Middle Eastern power?
Thank you. I wouldn't say India has become a Middle Eastern power, but it is definitely a recognition of India's role beyond its immediate region. So, in an extended neighborhood, I would say, whether it is on the east, where India is now increasingly being engaged by all major powers in quadrilateral security framework, and likewise in the west, also India is being recognized in this extended neighborhood as an important player. And one simple example of that could be that UAE, United Arab Emirates, is now the third largest trading partner of India. It is also one of the important investor in India. Increasingly, the investments of UAE in India are increasing. Other country which is engaged in this West Asian Quad is United States, which is the largest trading partner of India. So in that sense, it's a recognition of India's role in that extended neighborhood. And therefore, I would be cautious in describing India becoming a West Asian power. And the drivers, of course, has been both, again, long-term and the more immediate ones. You see gradually United States, and this was particularly visible during President Donald Trump's period, has been, US has been talking about burden sharing. US believes that its defense budget, which hovers around $700 billion, is bigger than the next 10 countries combined, is inordinate burden on United States to behave like a world policeman, and it wants its allies and its friends to also contribute to that kind of burden sharing. And that understanding on burden sharing has meant that it has gradually tried to uh, reduce its presence, reduce its responsibilities in the Middle East region. We remember during 1990s at the peak of Persian Gulf War, and American presence was enormous, about 100,000 soldiers at one point in time. It has come down really much, much smaller now. And therefore, it is looking for uh, finding non-military solutions, which means focusing on dialogue, on economic partnerships, and using those templates to find stability in the Middle East, or negotiations like the Iran nuclear deal, for example, as a template. Now, the template of Quad is also driven by more immediate factors, as I mentioned, which is where the pandemic period of last 2.5 years is very important, and India's credibility as pharmacy of the world, both in supplying vaccines when vaccines became available, but even before vaccines were discovered, supplying certain amount of cure to the pandemic coronavirus disease. India's paracetamol or India's hydroxychloroquine was going to 75 plus countries, in many of these countries as gifts. So that role of India during pandemic period is also something which is appreciated, and many of the Middle East countries also received those medicines and are receiving vaccines from India in that sense. So it's not a security provider role, but it's a kind of a welfare and soft power driven role that India has. And of course, more recently, Ukraine crisis also, which has created enormous food security and energy security crisis. India is an energy deficit country, and some of the Middle East countries are dependent on imports of food. And India, during this Ukraine crisis, has also begun to be seen as an important food exporter. I think about $40 billion of food exports total. In that sense, UAE and other Middle East countries see there's a complementarity with India. In working together, they can ensure India's energy security. India can contribute to ensuring their food security. And in that kind of focus is where this uh, I2U2, which is India, Israel, UAE, and USA, did their first summit meeting to see if this template can bring stability and peace in the Middle East, where India and USA would together contribute to that kind of a template, which is a reflection of the Quad in the Indo-Pacific. But of course, they are also different in that sense. So, to briefly close my comment on this question, I think it's a recognition of India's role beyond its immediate region, which I think is how India has been invited to be part of West Asian Quad.
Well, Professor, in your article, what you have mentioned about the quadrilateral security dialogue and this I2U2, obviously. My last question to you is that how do you see that India gets into these bigger major platforms, which are largely when the Americans think they think it from the security paradigm. But when India gets into those paradigms, India doesn't want to get into these security dynamics of those paradigms, and it wants a geo-economic, competition, or it wants that the geo-economic benefits to be for India. Do you think that India is confused? Do you think India is careful? Or do you think that India doesn't want to get into the trap of the great powers when India gets into the platforms, but India believes that it should not be enrolled, it should not be taken into, or not be given a security role? So, how do you find that dichotomy being there, but not taking the every responsibility of that platform?
Let me be a little immodest and cite that there are people today who believe that India itself is on the cusp of becoming a great power. So the sense of India falling into trap of any great powers, I think, is a little misplaced here. In that sense, India is very clear of pursuing its national interests, where welfare, economic partnerships uh, is the main focus, and skirting away and avoiding, sort of military tensions is a top priority for India. And the first Quad, which is in the Indo-Pacific Quadrilateral Security Framework, is a good example. And you're right that United States, particularly during Donald Trump period, President Donald Trump period, and you have to only see speeches given by Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State at that time, was clearly pushing it to become partly a kind of a military or security arrangement. And Chinese had started calling it Asian NATO. Chinese no longer call it now an Asian NATO, and because India withstood the standard policy that India has, that India doesn't want to see Indo-Pacific becoming either militarized or becoming a kind of an exclusive club of just few nations. And India withstood that, leading finally for United States to outsource the security element to AUKUS, creating another trilateral of Australia, US, UK, which will look after the security element. India is okay to look after non-traditional security areas, including issues like terrorism, climate change, trafficking. These are areas where India is happy to connect, but not in conventional sort of military security focus. And I think that is also clearly visible in the West Asian Quad, where I understand Australian Prime Minister Lapid, for example, is clearly focused on punishing Iran, or United States may be focused on containing in China's rising influence in West Asia, China's deal with Iran, for example, particularly, or dealing with Iran, or to some extent dealing with Russia. India and UAE relatively are not focused on geo strategy, they're focused on geoeconomics. So at least two partners of this Quad are definitely focused on only economic partnership. And therefore, if you see the statement that was issued by the Quad leaders, West Asian Quad leaders, we summit, it only has projects on clean energy and energy security, where you have fundamentally UAE and India pushing for that partnership, with Israel and USA, of course, giving their technology and expertise, given that they have advanced technologies and expertise in some of these areas. So I assume that just as India withstood uh, pressures in case of Indo-Pacific Quad, if there are any pressures, India will be able to perhaps, we hope and pray, withstand those pressures in West Asian Quad, and make sure West Asian Quad also focuses on issues of sort of energy security, food security, climate change. In fact, UAE is hosting the climate change conference next year, COP28. So UAE will be focused on climate change issues, and these are issues where India has always, since independence and even before independence, focused constantly on development, welfare, and achieving those through dialogue rather than through military means. In situations where military means have become inevitable, India had to defend its interests, and India has used military to defend its positions. But that's not where India has been focused. And I think that is again reflected in both the Indo Pacific Quad and the West Asian Quad, that India wants to push for partnerships for welfare and prosperity, and hoping that India's recognition as emerging power is increasing. India's voice perhaps will have a greater credibility and weight in coming times, and India will be able to do some kind of value addition at the extended neighborhood in both East and West in that sense. Thank you again, Qamar, for making me part of this discussion, and best wishes to your efforts in continuing this channel.
Thank you very much, Professor Swaran Singh, for always being so kind and helping us to understand the Indian foreign policy and giving us an academic perspective. Although you are in Canada these days, but sparing time for us. Thank you very much for being so kind.
Thank you.